This week I'm going to bind The Tale of Peter Rabbit. This is a family favourite for us, and I used my wife's copy from when she was little as influence for the formatting of the PDF I made. This binding style is the wonderful and undervalued Sewn-Board's binding. It's perfectly suited to children's books because it opens so well and it's easy to make and produces a wonderful looking book. It's perfect for people early on their bookbinding journey. I start by finding some suitable paper. I wanted a heavy paper that will resist being torn by little hands and is smooth and white to reproduce the wonderful images of Peter Rabbit, his family, friends, and his mortal enemy, Mr. McGregor. I found a very nice 200 GSM paper at OfficeWorks in A4 long grain with a matte finish, and it was suitable for inkjet printing. The finished book size I'm after is just under A6, and so I need short grain A5. This paper ticked all the boxes and I just need to cut it in half to A5. I did a heap of test printing using another 200 GSM paper I already had. 200 GSM is heavier than my printer is rated for. You just have to give it a go and see. The test prints went well and there was no problem with double-sided printing. The scanned, faded images didn't show up very well, but this wasn't the printer's fault, and I spent a day enhancing the images to make them print nice and vibrantly. Printing at the best quality, it took 3 hours on this economy Epson Workforce WF7840. When I grabbed the pile, I was confused as to why there were so many sheets. It had printed single-sided. I spent another couple of hours trying to work out why. Maybe I broke the printer. Even with the paper from the tests, it no longer would print double-sided from the manual feeder or the trays. Standard paper still printed double-sided fine. I ended up feeding the sheets through a second time and printing on the other side. This meant I finished with 2 copies, which is fine because I was so pleased with the result, I'm happy to have another copy. You can see the A5 paper will result in a larger text block than the original I'm using as my inspiration, but the Sewn-Board's binding doesn't have a square, and I'll trim it down so that the finished book is about the size of the original. In addition to the text block, I need 2 pieces of A5 short grain decorative paper for the end papers, 2 pieces of A5 short grain 300 GSM or 10-point card for the outside of the boards, and 2 pieces of A6 long grain 1mm board for the core of the boards. If you want to bind your own copy of Peter Rabbit, the PDF I made is available from my Patreon store, and the link is in the description. This is the first digital product I've made available for sale. I've tried to keep it affordable, and buying a copy is another way you can support the Daz Bookbinding YouTube channel. Once I have all the materials, I do the folding. The card for the boards, I gently fold it first and then fold it more crisply with the 1mm board inside of it so that the fold is in the shape of the edge of the board. For the Sewn-Board's binding, you want no swell. One way to reduce swell is to have more paper than thread in the sections. That shouldn't be a problem with 200 GSM paper. But I also don't want the sections to be too thick. I settle on 2 sheet sections and using one of my thinner linen threads. I used 25/3, but I should have used 40/3, which I used on the second copy. I had to do a bit of pressing to remove a bit of swell with the thicker thread. I also left everything under a weight overnight to compress everything and to get the air out, as bookbinders like to say. Such a small book with no squares doesn't need sewing support, but it is nice if the sections are connected to each other in between the kettle stitches. So I decided to do a single link stitch halfway between the kettle stitches. I made a punching guide for the holes. I marked trim marks 8mm in from the head and 5mm from the tail, and positioned the kettle stitches 12mm in from these. For the link stitch, I marked 2 holes 12mm apart in the centre. Adding a diagonal line at the head on the spine helps me to keep track of the head and for keeping the sections in order. I marked my punching guide on the wrong side for using right-handed, so I quickly use an awl to transfer the hole positions to the other side. One advantage of this is that I won't accidentally punch holes at any of the other marks I've made. Before I start sewing, I tip the end papers onto the outer sections. There's no advantage to sewing on end papers since the boards are sewn on with the sections. It's a very strong design, perfect for children's books. Sewing is very straightforward. The first two sections are joined at the head with a square knot, and I catch up the section below each time at the centre. This is often called French sewing. I only use this on small books without sewing supports, or on very large books, and I mean really large, over tapes, or the occasional book where the sewing will be visible, in which case it's more of a decorative element than a functional one. It can be both. I finish with a double kettle stitch. Now the sewing is done, I can attach the board pieces inside the folios of card to complete the cover boards. Because there is sewing thread inside the folios of card, I'll cut a thin sliver of board off the spine edges, but I want the board to be full width outside the kettle stitches. I glue it in at the spine and a bit at the head and tail where the board might be exposed. I forgot I'm planning to trim the book heavily at the head and tail, or I would have glued it in a bit more, but I can fix this later. I normally glue the spine by knocking the book up to the head and spine and putting it in a finishing press, but not everyone has a finishing press and you don't need one. It's common for professional bookbinders to glue the spine on the edge of the bench. They usually put some weight on it and just glue it up. The main reason they do it is because it's fast and time is money, and you can do this too. I'll pretend the bottom brick is the edge of my bench. The finishing press does give you more control, especially if you're trying to avoid gluing tapes and don't want to get glue on your floor. Because this book doesn't have a heavily lined spine, the material you use for the lining needs to be strong. I normally use a quality Japanese paper around 80 GSM. I forgot that I'd moved my paper to my storage locker. Instead, I use a high quality handmade paper. I cut a strip slightly wider than the spine and glue out the spine and paper and apply it. I use a paste brush to stipple the paper and work it down into the grooves between the sections and then rub it down through some rubbing down paper. Once the spine lining has dried, I trim the overhangs at the head and tail and then transfer the trim marks from the punching guide to the outside of the book. I then trim the edges with the guillotine with a nice newly sharpened blade. I always tell people not to cut grey board with the guillotine. This is a time where it can't be avoided. If you don't have access to a guillotine, then the best thing to do is to trim each section individually to the same size before sewing. You can get a very good result like this. I wouldn't try cutting the edge with a knife and a ruler. With the heavy paper and boards attached, it's likely to end in tears. Next week, I'll finish the book by covering it. Don't forget the PDF I made of The Tale of Peter Rabbit is available from my Patreon store, and the link is in the description below. As always, I really appreciate you hitting the big thumbs up button. If you're able and want to, you can support the making of more videos like this through Patreon or with a one-off contribution, and the details are in the description below. If you want to be notified of my future videos, please hit the subscribe button. Until next time, cheerio.